Welcome to Drink Beer, Think Beer, the podcast that gets to the bottom of every pint. I'm John Hall. This week, I'm bringing you a recent episode of the All About Beer podcast hosted by M. Sauter and Don Tess, where they talk about romantic facts and beer myths with author Jeff Alworth. It's a fun listen, and I wanted you to hear it. And if you like what you hear, please search All About Beer on your podcast platform and download new episodes when it comes out every 2 weeks. To support the work we do, please go to patreon.com/allaboutbeer. And to reach out with any questions or suggestions, you can get at me. It's John Hall, that's JOHNHOLL, at allaboutbeer.com. I'll be back with an original episode next week of this show. But in the meantime, please enjoy the All About Beer podcast.
I'm M. Sauter, better known as Pints and Panels.
And I'm Don Tess, better known as the Dawn of Beer.
Welcome to episode 52 of the All About Beer podcast. Every 2 weeks, we talk with leading experts and take a deep dive into one topic in beer. This week on this show, we have a very special guest. We're going to be talking about beer myth and romantic facts with beer writer Jeff Alworth. Please visit allaboutbeer.com and follow us on social media at allaboutbeer. And if you're feeling generous, please visit our Patreon page, patreon.com/allaboutbeer, to support this show and others. So Don, do you have a favorite romantic fact or beer myth that you want to talk about?
I do. My one thing that, actually kind of drives me crazy is people always insisting that the best beer is the freshest beer.
Oh, Jesus Christ. Yes.
Because now, fresh beer is better beer overall, generally speaking.
Yes.
There are exceptions to that. But the reality is that breweries are businesses, beers get canned as the schedule allows, or maybe when the mobile canner is there. It's not necessarily when the beer is the best. And there's many beers, particularly hoppy beers. Everybody talks about how hoppy beers have to be fresh.
No.
Well, hop burn is a thing, and
Such a thing.
Yes, time helps hop burn. So everybody calm down about the fresh. Fresh is better, generally speaking, but
yes,
calm down about it. How
put
about you,
Put your IPAs in the fridge for 3
Yes.
weeks if they're fresh. And then I like 21 days on my IPAs.
I'm more like 20 and a half, but
mine is a real American one where people think you can't get beer cold and then warm and then cold again. That's a very, obviously I'm not talking about like boiling it or freezing it, but you can buy beer in a cooler, leave it on your counter, put it back in the fridge, and you have not done anything wrong. It will be fine.
It'll be delicious.
Listen to me. I will stop shouting, but please don't do that. Just drink anyway. All right. Well, I'm really looking forward to talking with Jeff Alworth about some of his favorite romantic facts. But first, if you would like to help support the All About Beer podcast, please reach out to podcast@allaboutbeer.com. Speaking of supporting the show, here is a word from our sponsors.
Welcome to Estrella Galicia, where brewing excellence has been a family tradition since 1906. They're all about lager, rooted in German brewing heritage. Maintaining their commitment to tradition, they brew exclusively in their original brewery in La Coruña, Spain. Each beer boasts its own distinctive recipe. No shortcuts, no compromises. They shun high-gravity tricks and avoid additives, even in their alcohol-free beers, and stick firmly to traditional methods. Their passion for beer sets them apart as they embrace and celebrate the art of brewing. At Estrella Galicia, they love beer above all things. Experience the difference and learn more about it on Instagram at Estrella Galicia, USA.
Jeff Alworth is a writer living in Portland, Oregon. He writes about beer, cider, and occasionally politics. His books include The Beer Bible, The Widmer Way, The Secrets of Master Brewers. That's my M. Sauter's personal favorite.
Me too.
Real sleeper. Jeff, you want to read it, Jeff? And the audiobook, excellent. Anyway, and Cider Made Simple. Jeff has taught university courses about beer and the brewing business and regularly leads educational tastings and events. He has appeared widely on radio, podcasts like this one, and television, including CNN's Headline News and the History Channel. In the spring of 2024, Jeff helped found the nonprofit Celebrate Oregon Beer to promote the state's brewing and hop growing industries and to serve as the organization's executive director. Welcome to the show, Jeff.
Thanks for having me.
So you sent me a list, which I really liked that you did my work for me, and I respect
So well
that.
organized.
So well organized. But you apparently had a conversation with our esteemed editor and producer, John Hall, about something called like beer's romantic facts. Um, what do you mean by that?
Well, this is a thing that writers have to confront a lot. I think John and I were talking about um, these these things that kind of function as facts out in the world. I'm sorry, a truck is rumbling by. We have a lot of construction going on in our neighborhood right now.
Cool.
So,
Couldn't hear any of it, so you're
oh,
good.
good. You know, things that are kind of passed on from person to person until they have until everybody knows that they're right, but they're not really right. And John and I were talking about as writers how we have to try to negotiate these, and we came up with the word or the phrase romantic fact to describe these things that weren't actually facts. They were much more fueled by the story behind them, and in journalism they say sometimes a fact is too good to check, sort of like that.
Do you,
Is it like a myth? Is a romantic fact and the myth a same thing, or is it different?
Yeah, it can be a myth. I like to think of the romantic fact as having a little bit more of a story behind it. Being motivated by the whole theater of whatever great tale is being told. Um, and some of them are, yeah, some may be more myth than fact. I'm not sure where to draw that line, but beer really somehow, I think, because we sit around drinking beer at pubs, uh, passing these things back and forth, it really encourages the romantic facts maybe more than other industries.
do you find that some of these romantic facts, like they're so ingrained that if you try and correct people on them, you're the one who looks like an idiot?
Yeah, I mean,
Yes,
if
yes.
I'm if I'm hanging out with lay people and they start offering up a bunch of weird stuff about beer, I usually don't correct them.
Yeah, okay.
Why not? Why not? Why not? Why not?
I don't want to be that guy. Nobody, they're having
Oh,
fun. They're drinking beer.
I'm that guy.
Yeah, I mean, I used to, and sometimes I'll sort of redirect and say, "Oh, well, that's interesting. I know an interesting fact about, something, and maybe I won't refute it directly, but I'll kind of redirect, and so I don't
Hmm.
have to." A lot of times, these things do have very florid backstories, and I prefer not to. At least I prefer not to have to listen to them again.
Okay. So you did, I said before, you made us a list. And so we're going to go through them. And
We're
there's some
checking
really,
it
really,
twice.
yes. All of these are naughty and nice, I guess.
Yeah.
That didn't make sense at all. All right, let's get into this. So the first thing on the list for, I think, which is a really good establishment of a romantic fact is kind of a older one, which is the Bach tank dregs. Do you want to explain that? A lot. I mean, I'm of a certain generation, so I had never heard this until recently. It has a real like ask your elders vibe, but if you want to yeah,
Wow,
what is
am I ever
yeah,
insulted? But
what
anyways, keep going.
Well,
you are
as
old
your elder, let
yeah,
me
you are
gather
both older than
round,
me.
kids.
Yes.
I'll tell you what this was all about. So I think the reason I wanted to talk about this one first is because it sort of illustrates the dark ages, pre-internet, where and also kind of pre-craft beer, where people didn't know anything at all about beer, and so they would say really preposterous things that don't pass muster now because just generally we have a far better base of knowledge than we used to. And also, if it sounds really preposterous, people can pull out their phone and do a spot check, and and things like this would not survive. But the story is that when people used to tell this with just total conviction that Bach beer, and I think these are mostly Americans. I think this is an American romantic fact. Bach beer was produced by taking the dregs or the bottom part of the vat or barrel. I mean, people didn't even know what they were talking about, so it's a little bit hard to untangle what actually they were talking about. But anyway, that if you left a beer long enough, the dregs or the bottom of the barrel would become Bach, and that's where Bach came from. That was the story.
Right, because nobody cleans their brewery.
Yeah, there's so many like it makes no sense because like
No, it
it
really
makes
doesn't.
abs there it you wouldn't leave beer in the bottom. Maybe it's kind of like a krausening situation, but like even then,
Ooh.
like you wouldn't leave beer in like a no, I'm not. There's no way that this is possibly true. I'm not like I'm
I'm just
not like
impressed. Like Bach is a rare enough beer style. I'm just impressed people talk about it at all.
I
what
think that was part of the thing too. It was there were a few national examples, and they typically were darker. So maybe
Ah,
that was part of it. And back in the day, we had a few words floating around, and they seemed old-timey, and they spoke of a past that was inscrutable to our modern minds. And they were words like ale and Bach. And we didn't really know what they were, but they seemed cool and interesting. And maybe, Duke Wilhelm or Shakespeare used these words way back when, and they meant something.
well,
but there's
that
yeah, but Bach's also a beer that's only brewed once. It's a rarity. So if you don't know the brewing process and this beer shows up in the springtime
mm,
and you
This
don't
is,
know,
yeah, and I think this might be part of the fact, right? So they kind of understood that maybe Bach was a long, because Bach is typically a stronger beer. It's typically longer, lagered for longer. Um, and I wonder if somehow in the midst of time, those facts got fed into this thing. So the aging piece, which is sort of true, became the dregs piece. It's very difficult to guess the mind of this game of telephone that goes back decades.
that is a real shiner of a romantic fact.
Yeah.
Next up,
okay.
brewery ages. I think you're referring to one in particular in Germany, but maybe it's more than that.
Well, there's a whole bunch, really. I mean, the thing about so there's romantic facts that exist sort of outside of the beer industry that people tell about in breweries, and then there are romantic facts that exist within the brewery where within a brewery or within the industry, people really believe these facts, but they're also romantic. And then there are these facts, and this is the third kind, which are forwarded by breweries to create a mystique around their brand, or to confuse the customers, or in this case to connect themselves to a more distant past than they actually merit. Um, and European breweries are far worse about this than American breweries. I don't really think we have a lot of American breweries that are claiming to be really old when they're not. But I think one of the best examples that I have, there are others, but let's start here, is Stella Artois, which if you look at a label, it says 1366 on the label, which is really old, first of all. And Stella is a lager, and it would be an extraordinarily early lager, and lager wasn't being made in uh, Belgium at the time. So what does this all mean? Well, apparently the brewery connects it back to brewing activity in the village that happened in 1366, but the actual brewery of Stella Artois came much later, a
So
century
you're
later.
so you're telling me I can't go back in time to 13 and drink a Stella Artois.
Yeah, believe it or not. The
Damn it.
Belgians are really bad about this. The
Yeah.
Belgians often do this thing where they're like, "Well, brewing happened around here once, so let's put that date on our label."
Huh.
There have been people living in my village for over 100 years, so I must myself be over 100 years old.
There you go. By the transitive property.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I think this gets into these romantic facts. So I think nobody would argue that Stella should have 1366 on their label, but it does kind of get into a question of, what counts as continuity, and what, this is where the romantic fact gets into fact, and there's a blurry line in between. Weinstefaner is, the brewery in near Munich, is they have 1040 on their label, and it's a little bit more legitimate because monks started brewing there in 1040, and it seems like mostly there has been a connected lineage of brewing that's happened there. Although the there is a pretty vast area, and the brewery has moved around a lot. But it's no longer owned by monks, and there might have been breaks, and so it's, how do we think about that? It's there's definitely more continuity there, though.
Right.
So that I don't know if that's exactly a romantic fact, but I question whether that is the oldest brewery in the world.
I think that's a good romantic one because it's also one of those it's a bygone era of brewing. It's also one of those myths that's like not really for like it's a lie, but like do people really that's one of those like do people really care?
I
I
think
don't
it's worse than they do they really care.
really?
I think they want to believe it. I think that's cool.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, I gotta sometimes when I talk about this stuff, people uh push back on it, and if they're fans of the breweries, they try to defend them, and I get all that, but the three of us here are journalists, and we I think it's worth for us looking at the person or the entity who is trying to push this and think about why they might be trying to do that. And if a brewery is claiming some romantic fact as part of their biography, I think there's a really good chance that they're doing that because they want to sell more beer. And then we have to ask ourselves, is it our job to help them sell more beer, or should we be skeptical about some of the claims they put out there?
I
Well,
just
that's a,
want a
yeah.
huge ass party in 16 years.
And they will do that.
Yeah.
And we should
Yes.
go. But then it's kind of a lot. I don't know. But you touched on something that I want to talk about, which is the marketing aspect.
Mhm.
Because you have one here about milk stouts being nourishing.
Right. This is this is an interesting one, because in a way, it was far more benign than the slapping a super early date on your label. Back in the late 19th century, Britain changed its laws to allow beer to include things other than malted barley. And so, of course, the second they did that, brewers started throwing everything in their beer. And porters and stouts were the big kind of popular beer at the time. And it kind of makes sense that they would be one of the primary recipients of this new largesse, because stouts really lend themselves to other flavors. But an interesting thing was happening at the same time, which is that there was this belief, and it did not emanate from the breweries. It came from doctors. Medicine was really rudimentary at the time. It came from the doctors who believed that a stout was good for you. So they would prescribe it for nursing mothers. If you were laid up in bed, if you were what they called then an invalid, they thought it would be helpful. And so breweries started to key on this, and they're like, well, we should put stuff in there that seems more healthful. So they put stuff like oatmeal in it. And at one point they put lactose in the beer. You can't really put milk in it because it'll spoil. It doesn't really work, but you can put lactose in it. So they called those milk stouts. And because all the doctors were saying it was great for people, the breweries jumped on that bandwagon and started offering nourishing stouts, invalid stouts, nursing stouts. I think milk stouts were supposed to be good for nursing mothers. These were, of course, all romantic facts. These beers are no more or less healthy than other beers.
Is this like a Guinness is good for you, Guinness for strength type of thing?
Yeah, I think it did date to that era when that was kind of the popular belief.
So Guinness is not going to help me like lift my horse above my head and then walk down the street like the ads claim. This is
Well, full
flagrant falsehood.
disclosure, my longtime sponsor of my blog, the Guinness Brewing Company of Dublin, Ireland, uh, who's to say? I mean, they certainly make me stronger. I mean,
I'm not, yeah, I'm not, no disrespect. I love Guinness. I love Guinness. I'm just there's a toucan drinking a Guinness, and I'm just like, I didn't know birds drank beer.
I see toucans drinking Guinness all the time. I don't know what it's like
Oh,
over there in Canada.
yeah, we don't really. Yeah, that's fair.
I do want to point out that after the foray of lactose in milk stouts, that no brewer ever abused lactose again.
That's right.
It's never
I
happened.
don't see it at all anymore. So
Speaking of dark beers, the predecessor to stout was porter, and everybody knows that porter originated as a blend of three beers and was actually known for a time as three threads. Correct?
Right. This is maybe like the mother of all romantic facts. It's really a cool story, because it involves actual brewing there's truth to it, but also it's total hogwash at the same time. And it goes to show that if you start a romantic fact early enough, then eventually, and it gets written about in every book for decades or centuries, it really becomes solidified as fact. And that's what happened with porter, which was a beer that came out of London in the 18th century. And it was a strong beer, aged in vats, and it would get sherry-like, as the Brettanomyces we now know worked on the beer over time. And it had been around a long time when a guy named John Feltham, I don't know how you pronounce his name, wrote a book in which he conflated a practice that happened in the pubs with the way beer was made. And he described the process, which consisted of a third of ale, a third of beer, and a third of twopenny, which is strong pale ale, as being the way that you would make porter. And these are the kind of blends that would have happened at a pub. Ale, for those who may not follow 19th century brewing practice or pub practices, ale was a low hop beer and beer was a high hop beer. So brewers would often, or pubs would often blend beer, and that was common. So the three threads were these three different beers, which the publican would brew on, would blend on site for the customer. And this writer wrote that practice was what constituted porter. And for the next 200 years, people continued to launder that. And in fact, if you're old enough like me, you remember reading that in regular beer books, coming up. And I was like, oh, well, I of course don't know anything about English beer. I wasn't allowed 200 years ago. It seemed reasonable to me. Fortunately, we had historians come along.
I mean,
Sorry, that's my dog.
Oh, that's okay. Oh, it's nice that when dogs join the podcast. I mean, I'm younger, but I remember learning that and thinking
Yeah.
it was true. So I mean, there's a lot of things that are people still. I find that AI has been really enjoyable because they've been really digging up these romantic facts and passing them off as facts. And you're
Yeah.
like, I'm sorry, computer.
Well, AI just repeats stuff, right? So
Yes.
yeah.
It's just as
So in
yeah.
fact, we're gonna get more romantic, like it's gonna get worse thanks to AI.
I think
Well,
it
we
will
just
get worse.
Yeah. Well, anyway, we're going to take a small break. And when we come back, we've got more romantic facts with Jeff Alworth.
Craving a beer but want to skip alcohol? Meet Estrella Galicia 00. It's a 0% beer that's both refreshing and full of flavor. Using an innovative interrupted fermentation process, they create a golden, bright beer with floral, hoppy notes, along with aromas reminiscent of pale malts. With its light, crisp, and gentle bitter finish, Estrella Galicia 00 is perfect for any occasion. Brewed entirely in Spain, this alcohol-free beer delivers the authentic taste of Estrella Galicia. Experience the difference and learn more by visiting estrellagalicia.com.
All right, we're back. This is one that I like because I actually, when you put this in the list, I was like, but isn't that true? And then I felt foolish, which is good because I want to be correct. And it's when brewers understood what yeast was. If you can talk about that.
Yeah, this is a good one. You are in good company. I also had this totally wrong. And it was super embarrassing when I realized how wrong I was because I had all the data in front of me to not be wrong, but I was. So the story is that brewers prior to Pasteur didn't know what yeast was. And it wasn't just that they didn't know it was a small fungus that converted beer or worked to alcohol and carbon dioxide. It was that they didn't understand how fermentation worked at all. And so it was kind of regarded as a magic process that, medieval brewers didn't have any idea about. And that was also like the porter thing, absolutely totally bog standard. Everybody talked about that. And I guess it kind of made sense on a surface level. And apparently you bought it, I bought it. It seemed like, okay, that makes sense. The old timies, they didn't understand things like we smart people in modern times. But I was at Schlenkerla when my little bubble was burst, and Matthias Troon, the owner, one of the family owners, his family is, I think, the 6th generation or something on that brewery. He said, "Oh, no, that's totally wrong." And I know you Americans always say that, but it's totally wrong. And in fact, in medieval Germany, there was a guild called the Hafener Guild. So the yeast people who collected the yeast after every batch and kept it safe and sound. They actually pressed the beer out of it. They had some kind of yeast press. I don't know how this works, which the brewery would then sell that to the poor people for less money. And he's like, so they totally have it. And the light dawned on me, and I said, oh, of course, I homebrew. I know that there's no way you don't know what yeast is, because you brew and then you get this white layer of stuff at the bottom. And he said, Zoig, yes, it means stuff. Yeah, exactly. That's what they called it, Zoig. So, yeah. So, of course, brewers knew what yeast was. And of course, they pitched the yeast. They didn't know it was a microbiological process, but they understood exactly how it functioned.
And could manage it. Like, this wasn't happenstance and luck, like some people think.
Yeah. Totally. Yeah, totally.
So, speaking of yeast, tell us the romantic fact around smuggling lager yeast to Urquell.
Yeah, this is a fascinating one. I would love to know where this one came from. It was, pretty common, and you saw it everywhere. It was sort of like the porter thing. It was retold and retold and retold. And I don't know if the brewery was involved in that, because it's kind of a cool, the more myths or cool stories you get people talking about your beer, the better. It's just, if people are talking about your beer, that's a cool thing. But I mean, it's unnecessary, because that brewery is so important, and so much of the stuff that happened around the brewing of that first Pilsner beer was so important. But one of the stories that was told about that was that in order to brew that first beer in Pilsen, they had to smuggle the lager yeast in, because there was no lager yeast in the Czech Republic, or Bohemia. I think it was still the Austrian Empire, Austro-Hungarian Empire. I'm not sure when all those happened. I'm not good with empires, but anyway, the claim was that they had to smuggle it in, and there's one variation on it that it was monks who smuggle it in, which in beer, one of the romantic rules of thumb is, if monks are involved, it's probably a lie. Like, people throw monks into a lot of stories where monks don't belong.
Yeah.
But just
never trust a monk.
Well, the monks are fine, but people always try to make things more intriguing by the inclusion of monks. But of course, this was totally crazy. Brewer's yeast is not it's not that kind of commodity. Brewers trade yeast all the time. The brewer at Pilsner Urquell, the Burgers Brewery, was from Munich, so he could have just brought his own yeast. In fact, he bought it. The writer Evan Rail, who lives in Prague and has done a lot of research on Czech beer, I found the receipt. I don't think it was maybe for the first batch, but he was, early on, he was buying his yeast, which is what you would expect that would happen. So who knows where that came from? It just, I guess, captured people's imagination. It was too good to check, so they kept telling that story. But romantic fact.
Yeah.
So I have a question for you. That's one of them on your list. It's how old is lambic?
This is I threw this one on there because this is a disputed. This is one of those things that people debate about a lot now, and I wanted to talk about it. I'm glad you asked about it, because I think it is sort of the inversion of a romantic fact. You can bird dog things so much that you begin to see romantic facts where there is ambiguity or history, or things that are just not easy to pull apart. And the question of how old lambic is has kind of gotten a little currency. I'm going to forget the guy's name, but there's a Belgian, or he might actually be Dutch, writer who is really he really does not like the myths and sort of cool legends that surround lambic. And he wrote a book. He had a website, and he talked about this on the website. And then he finally wrote a book where he wanted to forward the argument that lambic beer was very recent, maybe like 150 years old, not 500 years old, as the lambic brewers talk about. And so here we have, the assertion of a romantic fact. His idea is that the brewers in, Bruegel's time, when we see that beer that it's in those paintings, that was not lambic beer because for a number of reasons that he cites, but I think they're all kind of bad. And I think his failure to understand how beer evolves and changes means that if you get too prescriptive about some of these definitions, then basically you see no continuity, because beer is constantly evolving. And if you look back 500 years ago in the area around Brussels, and you ask what kind of beer people are brewing, you will find spontaneously fermented wheat ale, which may or may not have oats, and which is sometimes served fresh and sometimes aged. But the proportions are different. The word lambic hasn't come into use yet. The word gueuze hasn't come into use yet. But it's basically lambic. The continuity between the beer that people were making then and now is far, far closer than the continuity between what English brewers were calling porter in the late 1700s and what we call porter today. And nobody claims that porter didn't start in the 18th century. So I feel like sometimes the romantic fact question can be turned on its head too. So if you're spending too much time with people debunking romantic facts, you can also be skeptical about that.
Fair. That is
fair. I like that.
That is fair.
Before the 18th century, porter was only 2 threads.
Good one.
Let us jump over the pond to America and talk about one of my favorite beers. And the reason I love this beer so much is because I can taste the beechwood aging.
Yeah, beechwood aging. Yeah, I threw this one on there because this is a great example of how romantic facts will settle onto a brewery, and they begin to believe things that it's really difficult to believe if you step outside the brewery. So I was in 2011, the last brewery I visited before I finished my the beer Bible was the great brewery in St. Louis, the old Budweiser brewery there. And it is, if anybody, even if you're a craft beer fan and you hate Budweiser, if you're near there, you should definitely take the tour. It's one of the prettiest breweries I've ever seen. And I've seen a lot of pretty breweries. So I was hanging out with Jim Bickline. We were cruising around, and it's this ultra modern brewery. They have a lot of incredibly advanced and sophisticated processes. It seems like the kind of brewery where only science guides everything, no tradition. And in fact, they have some old equipment around and that they've harvested from earlier iterations of their brewing process. And we were laughing at how back in the day, people thought that equipment was super cool and it did all these great things, when in fact it was kind of bad for the beer. All of that, we're having a great time, and then we get to the beechwood aging piece. And for those who don't know, Budweiser is actually beechwood aged. There are these weird strips that they use. It's not quite as romantic looking as you'd expect.
Aged might be a bit generous, but go ahead.
It's weird. It's weird looking. It's like twisted, and they show it. They're very on the tour. I took the tour at the Fort Collins one in Colorado, and they love to bring that up.
They do, absolutely. And they have these little, torpedo-like things that they put the beechwood in and put that the lagering tanks. And I guess the idea originally was that the beechwood would collect the yeast, maybe even attract it, that it was hydrophobic or philic or whatever, it attracts yeast. I don't know. Anyway, we got to this piece, and Jim really starts going into how great beechwood aging is and how it is really important to the character of the beer. And I'm like, Jim, what are you talking about, man? Are you telling me that you can't make Budweiser without these beechwood strips? That if the beechwood tree went extinct, that you could not make Budweiser that was indistinguishable in flavor from the Budweiser you're making now? And he sputtered for a minute, and then we remembered our earlier chat, and he started laughing, and I started laughing. And it was one of those moments when I developed an enormous affection for Anheuser-Busch, because even within the brewery, they are committed to beechwood aging as like an
They are.
important part of the character of the product. And that I think probably everybody outside the brewery just thinks it's a stupid marketing gimmick, but no, they actually really care
They
about it
believe it.
inside the brewery, and that's kind of cool.
From now on, I'm going to refer to Bud Light as son of a beach.
On. See what I have to deal with, Jeff.
That one
You're
wasn't.
laughing. You're laughing.
It wasn't
Uh,
bad.
Where?
It wasn't. All right. Anyway, okay. So I want to. What the next thing you just wrote is just IPA stuff, and I want to know what that means.
Well, I heard I believe you mentioned that you're going to be talking to.
Yes, on a future episode, we are going to have an IPA myths episode.
Yeah,
But I
they're
didn't
just-
know if there were any romantic facts about IPA that you wanted to bring up.
there's Pete you're gonna have a whole episode on Pete with Pete, and I think IPA is a perfect, if you were gonna write a chapter in a book about romantic facts and you wanted to use a case study, I think IPA is a perfect case study, and I think Pete's gonna walk you through all the wonderful romantic facts. So I don't need to get into those, but another one that is on my list is hazy IPAs.
Yes,
And
it
I think
was.
we can maybe extend. He may not talk about hazy IPAs because that's an American thing. So we could maybe talk about that as a piece of all of this.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead. So yeah, you wrote haze has something to do with flavor and hazy IPA.
Yeah. So hazy IPAs came along to this region of the country where IPAs didn't have a long tradition, and it was at a moment. We're talking about the early teens when there's this explosion in these new flavorful hops coming on the market. Citra Mosaic are out, and breweries everywhere, not just in New England, but everywhere, are really starting to shift towards a juicier profile, getting away from bitterness, making their beers really, fruity and saturated. But in New England, it's a place that doesn't have a long tradition of tasting IPAs or have seen this evolution. This evolution started in the mid-aughts on the West Coast, maybe even earlier than that. But it kind of comes out of nowhere in New England, and it comes in this weird package where these beers, because of the way they're made, and partly because they're on small systems, so they're just generally a little bit more rustic. They're very hazy, and then people started associating all this flavor and aroma profile with the haze, and breweries like couldn't get out of that because the customer expectation was that the hazy IPA had the juice, so the haze must cause the juice. And it was really for a hot minute. This will probably be memory hold, but having written about it, I remember a lot of people were writing about that there was that conflation happening, and breweries were trying to make their beer as hazy as possible, and when in fact what they were really selling was the juice, not the haze, but people were buying the haze. And that was a fascinating kind of romantic fact that was bubbling up real time.
I even heard of some breweries adding flour to their beer to make it hazier.
Right.
Just bizarre. Yeah.
I mean, they definitely try to accentuate it, and did for years, the use of wheat and oats
A lot of
were,
wheat oats, yeah.
yeah, they were partly for mouthfeel, but they were also partly just to increase that haze. It was just the visual piece was such an important part of that. And there was kind of this conflation about what was cause and what was effect. And really the haze was the effect, not the cause.
Yeah. This is one I'm excited to talk about because I'm a nerd. And it's one I believe, so I'm gonna have to do some research after you explain it to us, Jeff. But cohumulone, high cohumulone hops cause harsh bitterness.
Yeah, so this is an industry-wide belief, and it was really common for I don't know how many decades, but and it really came into vogue in the modern era. It was cohumulone is a component of hops. It is I don't know what you call that, a chemical compound. So we had the ability to identify and test for cohumulone. And the idea was for a long time that if you had a high cohumulone hop, it would produce a rugged bitterness. And this was just basically taken as gospel. And one of the reasons that we still, when you look at hop constituents, when you go to a hop site and they show what's in a hop, they still mention what the cohumulone level is. It dates back to this being a really important component, people thought, of whether the beer was going to have a rough bitterness or a smooth bitterness. And partly it mirrored the thinking at the time, which was that the noble variety hops from continental Europe, particularly continental Europe, but also like East Kent Golding and a few others elsewhere, they all had low cohumulone and they produced what the Europeans thought of as very fine bitterness, whereas the American hops, which were always really pretty rugged, produced with their higher cohumulone levels, produced rugged bitterness. So it was just an unexamined belief for decades. I don't know how long, but once they started actually examining it and doing research and trials, they found that cohumulone was not correlated with fine bitterness. So it's kind of fallen away. Interestingly, cohumulone now plays an interesting role in terms of whether the cohumulone level versus the oh no, I'm sorry, that's alpha and beta. I got confused. Never mind. I don't know why
Hop science is really like all
Yes.
that like lupulin, alpha acids, beta acids, when they actually like activate the
Down
amount of like
thiols, free
yeah,
thiol.
yeah,
Oh,
thiols, myrcene, linalool.
oh.
And
Lord have
like-
mercy.
the thing about all of this is, you have the objective and the empirical in the fact that there is linalool in hops. There's cohumulone in hops. Biotransformation happens. All these things exist. But then we have the subjective, which is how do they impact the flavor of beer, the flavor and aroma of beer, which, if you go back to the cohumulone thing, the concept of fine bitterness is pretty darn subtle. I'm actually of the belief that it defines something real. But once you start asking a bunch of people what fine bitterness is, I think you start getting into some pretty darn murky waters. And that's so true with so much of what's going on with hops. A lot of it is, the only way we have to evaluate it is subjectively, even though we know that stuff is in there. Ultimately, it's all about our aesthetic appreciation. So it becomes pretty challenging.
Harsh bitterness is the result of insufficient beechwood aging.
That's not one
No,
I've heard.
no.
But let's
No,
get it on a few
no,
websites and
no.
into the AI machines.
No. All right. Jeff, thank you so much for coming on
Sorry,
the
there's,
program today. More dogs. Totally fine.
That's the mailman.
We like
Rosie
dogs.
stays
It's
Oh.
all
on
good.
mailman.
The mailman's early. Doesn't the mailman come later?
Yes, typically he's a couple hours early, but we're
Wow.
recording, so of course he came early.
Of course, of course. For people who want to ask you more about cohumulone, do you have a website or social media that we can direct them to?
Yeah, my website is beervanablog.com. That's kind of the hub for everything. Find all my contact stuff there. It's probably the best way to find me.
Cool.
I'm on
Great.
all the social medias, but
What's your social media handle?
on Twitter it's @beervana. On Instagram it's jeff.alworth. I don't know what it is on Facebook. Just Google.
That's fine.
Yeah, search it.
Yeah, just look it up. Jeff,
I am
thank you so
not. I'm not
much.
on TikTok, and
That's
I'm
I am
on
all,
TikTok.
yeah, that is TikTok is confusing and I don't understand it. And yes. Anyway, Jeff, thank you so much for spending a bunch of time with us to walk through this list. I hope people learned something today. I feel like I did. So really
If
appreciate
nothing
it.
else, just question the things that people say,
That is a very good point.
especially if it comes from me.
Yeah, I think bringing some skepticism in is something that, once I started writing professionally, I started actually looking at some of these things in a way that I didn't when I wasn't writing about them, but yeah, I bring a new level of skepticism in, which you don't have to write about beer to be skeptical of some of this stuff.
That's
right.
fair. Cool.
Thank you, Jeff.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff.
Thanks for having me, guys. It's always lovely to talk to you too.
Yeah, cheers.
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 So, Don, what'd you think about that? I learned, this was an episode where I felt like I really learned a lot, which is normally we
Yes.
learn
No,
a
I
lot,
agree with
and
that. Yeah. I
that
agree with
the yeast one, like I really, and like, yeah, if you think about it, because that's
that.
like, oh, it
Isn't
was,
that the lesson? Like, if you think about it.
if you think about it, like, oh, like they had that, they had that broom and they would stir it, and like, no, there's
Well,
people
and the
who,
whole
oh
last
my
name,
God,
Hefner,
I
comes from
know.
somewhere.
They were basically the white labs of the like,
Yeah.
of the Middle Ages, like I know a bunch of people named Hefner, and like, oh, okay, that's where your last name comes from. Like, wild.
Yeah.
I'm really excited because we're going to do a future episode about
More myths.
IPA, more myths, so
Yeah.
many myths. So we want to let you, the listener, please email us, contact us at All About Beer on Instagram or on Facebook. Please let us know about IPA myths you've heard, that you would like confirmed, or ideas or anything that you've confirmed, and we can confirm and debunk it with you with our extra special guest. What do you think about that, Don?
I think that's a great idea.
I love it. Please visit allaboutbeer.com and follow us on social media at allaboutbeer. And once again, if you're feeling generous, visit our Patreon page, patreon.com/allaboutbeer, to support this show and others. If you have any questions for the experts, email podcast@allaboutbeer.com. That's also the email for feedback, suggestions, or to inquire about supporting this show through advertising. Don, how can people reach out to you if they want to talk to you about Cohumalone?
Oh, I think people should talk to me about freshness of IPAs.
There you
And
go.
I am at the Dawn of Beer on X, Threads, and Instagram. And people can drop me an email at dawn@thedawnofbeer.com. And Em, if people want to talk to you about warm and cold beer,
Oh, Jesus Christ. Yes, I am at Pints and Panels across all social media, and my website is www.pintsandpanels.com. If you enjoy this show, please share it with your friends, post about us on social media, and like and subscribe to the show. Please help us spread the word of good beer. And here's a final word from our sponsor.
Craving a beer but want to skip alcohol? Meet Estrella Galicia 00. It's a 0% beer that's both refreshing and full of flavor. Using an innovative interrupted fermentation process, they create a golden, bright beer with floral, hoppy notes, along with aromas reminiscent of pale malts. With its light, crisp, and gentle bitter finish, Estrella Galicia 00 is perfect for any occasion. Brewed entirely in Spain, this alcohol-free beer delivers the authentic taste of Estrella Galicia. Experience the difference and learn more by visiting estrellagalicia.com.
This show is produced by All About Beer. Visit allaboutbeer.com for articles, notes on this show and others, and to connect via the newsletter and social media. Cheers, everyone.
cheers.